Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are across the globe. And to welcome online viewers. My name is Susan Hopgood, and I am the President of Education International, the Global Federation of Education Unions, with more than 32 million teachers and education support personnel in 384 organisations in over 178 countries and territories. And I'm honoured to moderate this webinar on teachers and inclusive education, which is co-hosted by Education International, UNESCO, the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, and the Global Education Monitoring Report. We are happy to welcome over 300 people on the platform and countless others watching the discussion on YouTube. If you are on the platform, please share the city and country where you are calling from in the chat. And before we start the proceedings, let me start with a little housekeeping. Today's event is available to view in English, Spanish and French, as well as American Sign Language. If you are joining on the platform and would like to change your language, please select Watch Live Event in your preferred language from the navigation menu at the top of your screen. Live captioning is also available for today's event. If you are watching on Facebook, click the settings wheel to enable live captions. Friends, just 2 weeks ago, the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, the GEM report, was launched and reminded us that even before the pandemic, the right to education for all students was far from being achieved. An estimated 258 million children and youth are worldwide excluded from education systems. The GEM report calls on decision makers to widen their understanding of inclusive education that caters for the needs of all learners, no matter their identity, background, or ability. In inclusive education systems, everyone's contribution to the classroom is valued and safe. Inclusive learning environments model safe and inclusive societies, which benefit all. Well-qualified, trained and supported educators and education support personnel play a key role in achieving this. The important role teachers play is at the heart of our ongoing collaboration with UNESCO and the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. As part of this important network, we have been advocating for the need for teachers and their representative organisations to be involved in genuine social and policy dialogue and consulted in all aspects of teacher policy and practice. We stand together in challenging times such as these and beyond. Today, indeed, we find ourselves in the midst of a global education crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic that has further exacerbated inequalities, particularly for the most vulnerable students and teachers. Education International and its member organisations have taken significant measures to provide guidance on how to address education in the times of COVID-19. We need to ensure that the right to education for every child, as well as decent working conditions for all educators and education support personnel, are considered when schools are intermittently closed and reopened. Education International adopted 12 guiding principles to inform teacher unions and its government's response to the coronavirus crisis in education and launched a survey to assess the impact of COVID-19 on education. One major concern is that governments in their responses to the pandemic have often left the most marginalised behind. In this webinar, we will discuss inclusive education for all children and youth, including those with disabilities and from other marginalised groups from the perspective of teachers. Here I am happy to welcome a diverse and experienced panel that includes teachers, school leaders, education unions, international organisations and governments. And before we move to the first speaker, we want to thank all those who have posed their questions prior to the event. We want to hear from you, and we'll get to some of your questions later in the session. We invite you to type in your questions throughout the event in the live chat or on Twitter using the hashtag #AllMeansAll. We might not be able to address more than a few today, but we will be collecting them for later use. And now, friends, it's time to hear from our first speaker, UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education, Stefania Giannini. Welcome, Stefania.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining from all around the globe. And it's a great pleasure for me on behalf of UNESCO to welcome you today to this joint reflection discussion on the essential role of teachers and the teaching for inclusion, following the very successful launch of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on inclusion and education 2 weeks ago. All means all. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report warns that education opportunities continue to be unequally distributed. We must be very aware of that. 1 in 5 children, adolescents, and youth are entirely excluded from education worldwide. Stigma, stereotypes, discrimination, millions more are further alienated inside classrooms. They are inside and they are outside at the same time. Let me put it like this. It has never been more crucial than now to make education a basic, fundamental, universal right and a reality for all. Our rapidly changing world is now facing major challenges. I cannot avoid to mention the COVID-19 pandemic, which are living, obliging us to live in an unprecedented situation. But we also can refer to climate change, conflict, racism raising up again, and intolerance, and many things we know. And this contest, this unprecedented situation will further widen inequalities and can have an impact for decades to come, for the future to come, unless we take action, unless we can work together on a clear mission. The COVID-19 crisis is posing unprecedented challenges to inclusive education. It's exposing a digital divide, stretching teacher capacity, and setting inclusivity backwards for learners who lack connectivity. But more importantly, the report shows us that inclusive education cannot be achieved without teachers. Let me say with rhetorics about that. Teachers have been, during this crisis, the real human link between the traditional classroom was not more available and the virtual ones, and could support and prepare their children to face, and families and parents as well, to face this quite new situation. And teachers must be supported and prepared to create a classroom where all learners have their place in this crisis and beyond the crisis as well. As we'll see today, many teachers feel that have been inappropriately prepared to face diversity in the classroom. And the report is a clear call for our collective action to right this wrong. We also need more teachers. We know there is a shortage of teachers of some almost 70 million around the world. Is a country, is a big European country the size of this community missing still. And they are themselves representative of the same diversity we see in our society and in our classrooms. So since its foundation, as you know, UNESCO has turned the spotlight on the important role of teachers, and we are proud to host the Secretariat of the International Task Force for Teachers for Education 2030. The task force recently issued a call for action on teachers, stressing the need for teachers to be protected, supported, and recognized during the COVID-19 crisis. And let me emphasize also the great cooperation we have with Education International and the new kind of partnership we bring together with the Global Education Coalition that UNESCO established since the very beginning of this crisis, the end of March, where now we are working with more than 130 partners, companies, NGOs, networks, working to support countries with immediate solutions with building e-learning systems where connectivity is not so good, also supporting an integrated approach, more traditional radio, TV channels, but more than this, really focusing on the role of the human component inside of learning and teaching. And I think that the flagship program and project we have together with Education International and our partners and the coalition on teachers can really become more and more relevant in the coming future. I wish you well in your discussion today, and thank you very much for inviting me, Suzanne.
And thank you very much, Stefania, particularly as I know that you have a very, very busy and very busy schedule today. So it's great to have you here. And it's always been a pleasure for Education International to collaborate with UNESCO. Together we have and will continue to ensure that every child, youth and adult is taught by a qualified, trusted and supported teacher. Friends, we're now excited to see the video animation on the recently launched 2020 GEM report.
Everyone is different. The 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education believes that education is strongest when it embraces diversity. Learners should not have to adapt to the system. Instead, education systems should adapt to their needs. When students do not feel welcome in school, they are less likely to learn. This is everyone's loss. But rich and poor countries too often educate some children apart. Children who have a disability, have been displaced, speak a different language, or are poor and disadvantaged. School design may favor some students over others, as do many laws and policies. Teachers are often ill-equipped to cater for students' diverse needs. Children may not recognize the way they are portrayed in textbooks. Some may not see themselves there at all. They receive the message that they do not belong. Testing sometimes follows a narrow vision of education, and consequently, some students leave education earlier than they should. These are complex problems to solve, but a belief in the right to education is a belief in inclusion. Children have different learning speeds and needs. They need curricula that are flexible, creative, and relevant. How we prepare teachers matters. They must be given the tools and training to achieve our vision for reform. The resources we know can help the marginalized, educators, support staff, and equipment should be shared so that everyone can benefit. Better data on those left behind will help us reach them. Disadvantages often accumulate. We can't address inclusion one group at a time. Redressing these disadvantages requires funds. These must be equitable and target individual-specific needs. We must work together on these tasks across government ministries, from central to local authorities, with civil society supporting governments, and schools opening doors to the community. Inclusion in education requires a change in mindset in society, so that education for all means education for everyone, without exception. Achieving this is everybody's business, including yours.
Colleagues, we've just heard a call to action from the GEM report highlighting the cornerstones. Oh, I beg your pardon. We actually haven't heard it because we haven't heard from Manos yet. I beg your pardon. We've just heard a call to action from the GEM report highlighting the cornerstones of inclusion in education, and we're going to now hear further about that. We've heard that we need serious efforts to empower, prepare, support and motivate the education workforce and ensure that all teachers are prepared and supported to teach in inclusive classrooms. Now we're going to hear some of the findings and recommendations for the 2020 GEM report from the report's director, Manos Antoninis. Welcome to you, Manos.
Thank you, Susan, and it's an honor to co-organize this launch of the report with the teacher community. Like the International Teacher Task Force, we're also kindly hosted by UNESCO, and it is a real great opportunity to be able to share with the world's teachers the findings, to get their contribution to transmit these very powerful messages everywhere in the world, thanks to your support. So the Global Education Monitoring Report has the mandate of the international community to monitor progress on education in the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And it is thanks to our advisory board that the theme of inclusion was selected in a few years ago. And the reason why that might have happened is that when all countries committed to achieve inclusive education by 2030, it was not entirely clear, perhaps to many, what they were really signing up to. In the report, and this graphic, I think, gives the perspective that the report is taking, we refer to inclusion in education as a process that embraces diversity and builds a sense of belonging to achieve social cohesion. And these actions in the education field should be rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential. Inclusion is about not discriminating against anyone. It is about not rejecting anyone. It is about adapting to learners and making accommodations. It is not about the learners adapting to the system. Now, we know well that the case for inclusion has been championed by those who have supported the rights of people with disabilities, who ensured their right to inclusive education was guaranteed in international law in 2006. But it took the committee another 10 years, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to issue its general comment number 4, to actually help interpret this right. Because the committee realized that inclusion is not about one group. The mindset and the mechanisms that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those excluded. Every society in the world needs to own up to their mechanisms that exclude. Unfortunately, identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunities. A discussion of inclusion, of course, has to start from the 258 million children, adolescents, and young people who are out of school. In 12 countries, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely never to go to school compared to their peers. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. The world set a target for all to complete secondary school by 2030, and yet in at least 20 countries, the report found that not a single poor rural girl was completing secondary school. And among those who complete lower secondary school, the richest students are twice as likely to learn the basic skills compared to the poorest. Ensuring that all children learn requires thinking about students' experiences and well-being. You heard about stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination, as Mrs. Giannini said, alienating more inside classrooms than even those who are left outside classrooms altogether. LGBTI students in the United States are 3 times more likely to stay at home because they feel unsafe. Grade 4 students in middle and high income countries who are not learning in their home language are 1/3 less likely to learn basic reading skills. There is one key overarching recommendation for all those involved in education, which a wide range of partners championing inclusion have endorsed and supported. Inclusion cannot be achieved if it is seen as an inconvenience, or if people harbor the belief that children's capacity to learn is fixed. The report calls on all countries to widen their understanding of inclusive education to encompass all learners, regardless of identity, background, and ability. The report is for everyone and refers to all countries: the albinos in sub-Saharan Africa, the stateless in Arab countries, the Roma in Europe, the displaced Rohingya in Asia, the Afro-descendants in Latin America. Yet many governments do not base their laws and policies on this principle. The report found that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but only 57% of those cover multiple marginalized groups. Interventions should also be coherent from early childhood to adulthood if they're going to have an impact. But coming to teachers, analysis of information collected for 168 countries showed that 61% provided some elements of training on inclusion. But how this is interpreted varies and is an issue that we will explore later this year in more detail in a policy paper. Around a quarter of teachers in middle and high income countries reported a high need for professional development on teaching students with special needs. Across 10 Francophone sub-Saharan African countries, just 8% of grade 2 and grade 6 teachers had received in-service training on inclusive education. But, and this is a key message of the report, teachers should not be taught inclusive approaches as a specialist topic. Inclusion should be at the core of their education. All teachers should be prepared to teach all students. For example, in New Brunswick, Canada, a quarter of all teachers were trained to support students with autism. Mainstream and special school teachers tend to be trained separately, and the latter are more likely to be negative about inclusion as the best way to educate all students. In poorer countries, NGOs often lead professional development opportunities, which to some extent shows both the low priority that governments are placing on inclusion and the risk that such training may not be within a broader inclusion context. And it is not sufficient for teachers just to have knowledge. They also need good working relations, good working conditions, and support. Education officials who monitor implementation of inclusive teaching also need training. And support personnel that were mentioned in the introduction can accompany a transition towards inclusion as long as they supplant rather than substitute teachers. But a survey that was organized by Education International showed that they were always available in no more than 22% of countries. Teachers tend to have positive attitudes toward inclusion, but also some doubts about its feasibility. Some teachers may have entrenched views about students' potential to learn. In Lebanon, teachers did not believe that all students with disabilities could be successfully included. Some teachers may simply not believe that inclusion is possible and desirable. In 43 middle and high-income countries, 1 in 3 teachers reported that they did not adjust their teaching to students' cultural diversity. Part of this may be down to the fact that teachers may not be immune to social biases and stereotypes. In the United States, 31% believe that inequality was mainly due to African Americans lacking motivation. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, grade 8 mathematics teachers were more likely to give white students a passing grade than their equally proficient and well-behaved black classmates. In Italy, girls assigned to teachers with implicit gender bias underperformed in mathematics and chose less demanding schools. Such biases are detrimental to student learning. Teacher education, therefore, needs to tackle such entrenched views that some students may be unable to learn. An inclusive school ethos is key to making all students feel that they belong and can realize their potential. Schools that should value and accommodate student diversity and promote respect for all school community members. This includes activities that create safe and inclusive school environments, and we will hear from some of the participants later some really great initiatives. Effective and supportive school leadership, while not enough by itself, is highly conducive to an inclusive school climate. For school leaders to effectively promote an inclusive school environment, they need autonomy to be able to make the right decisions, but they also require specialized training. The 2018 OECD TALI study showed that nearly 1/5 of head teachers had no instructional leadership training. And across the 47 countries and education systems that took part, 15% of head teachers reported a high need for professional development in promoting equity and diversity, with the share reaching as much as 60% in Vietnam. Finally, the teaching body should reflect social diversity. However, teacher diversity often lags behind population diversity. In India, the share of scheduled castes in the teaching profession has increased, but remains below average. And as the graph shows, the teaching profession in the United States is highly unrepresentative of the population. Underrepresentation is fueled in every step, from entering initial teacher education to remaining in the profession. The report, of course, views inclusion from a very wide perspective and includes a range of other recommendations. I'll just briefly pass through them and invite you to take a closer look at the report itself. The first is that financing needs to be targeted to those who are left behind, because there's no inclusion without all these millions of children coming back to education. Unfortunately, still, ministries of education struggle to see how they can collaborate with other ministries to achieve the same objectives. Governments need to ensure that there is cooperation across departments, sectors, and tiers of government, especially as local governments are increasingly responsible for delivering education that is inclusive. And because the transition from special education to inclusive education is not a small feat, it's necessary to share expertise and resources. It's the only way to achieve that transition. Universal design, which is commonly associated with infrastructure, but also is associated with the universal design for learning, is a sign of the flexibility that we need for curricula, textbooks, and assessments that fulfill learners' potential. Governments and other partners at the school level need to engage in meaningful consultation to reassure those who may have doubts. Non-government actors, as you already heard, can play a powerful role as watchdogs, but also as providers of education services. But their role needs to be supported and also needs to fall in line with government policy on inclusion. And finally, data on and for inclusion are extremely important to highlight where the problems are, but that should be done with attention and respect. We should avoid labeling of vulnerable students that stigmatizes them. I'll finish with a reference to a new website that we launched 2 weeks ago together with the launch of the 2020 report. It's called PEER, which stands for Profiles Enhancing Education Reviews. It's a description of laws and policies on inclusion in education and complements 2 of our existing websites that have been focusing primarily on quantitative aspects of progress in education. The World Inequality Database on Education, which we launched 10 years ago, and the Scope, the Scoping Progress in Education, a very interactive site that we invite you to follow, as it complements very nicely the monitoring part of our report, to which I haven't really referred today. PEER in itself, as you see on this side, is responding to the need for all those who have an interest in comparative education and who are asking at some point, how does country X or country Y approach one on the other education policy issue? It aims to address this need and fulfill the report's mandate to monitor national SDG 4 strategies. In this first edition, PEER includes profiles that describe how every country in the world outside Europe, that is already covered through other means, particularly the role of the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education. So how every country in the world approaches inclusion in education through its laws and policies. We use these profiles to map trends on selected issues by region, some of which I described already. We believe much can be learned from countries sharing experiences and want to see PEER supporting regional or sub-regional processes. In a world that is increasingly facing uncertainty and precariousness, inclusion has to be central to the future of education. I would like to thank you very much for your help in disseminating these messages, and I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the report in the second half of the year, we'll be also launching 2 regional editions, one focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean, and the second one on Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. So please do stay tuned, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Manos. It's very good to hear what the report tells us, such important information for us all to act on. And now we're going to hear from teachers, school leaders and education workers, union representatives, each hailing from a different corner of the globe, who are championing initiative approaches to fostering inclusion inside and outside the classroom. I will introduce each one of them as they're about to speak. And so we'll hear first from Mark Potter, principal of the Berhampur School in Wellington, New Zealand, known for its success in inclusive practice and advocacy for children with diverse needs. He is also on the national executive of the NCDI Tiroa, the largest education union in New Zealand. Welcome, Mark, and we look forward to hearing from you. And my first question, Mark, we've just heard from Manos that a key barrier to inclusion in education is the lack of belief and political will that is possible and desirable to make education systems and schools truly inclusive. As a school leader, can you tell us how at your school, how you are fostering an inclusive learning environment that meets the needs of all learners and views diversity as a key asset to learning?
Thanks, Susan. Yes, as Manos said, it's about attitude. So a school, indeed school systems and indeed countries are as inclusive as they want to be. And that's one of the big barriers. So it's about educating people to make sure that we are as inclusive as we can possibly be. We are lucky that the New Zealand Educational Institute is a very committed union to inclusive education. That comes about because it represents lots of different providers within the education sector. So that's been quite an inspirational place for my school to be working. We have, in our school, we've developed a vision statement that is developed with our community. And that statement is that Berhampur School is everyone's school. Now, when we developed that with the parents, the children, the teachers, we're all clear that everyone meant everyone, no exceptions. And unfortunately, too often in our schools around the world and in New Zealand, exceptions are made. Everyone except those people that we don't quite approve of or they don't quite fit our little setup. So what we've done is to take that vision into reality. We worked with the UNESCO Salamanca Statement from 1994, which had brilliant aspirations for inclusive education. We linked that with the Inclusion for Index that Ainscough and Booth developed in the UK. And so what we've done is we've developed like a triangular way of thinking that permeates everything we do. So we have the concept that diversity is what we see, and we have lots of diversity occurring in our school and our community. Belonging, that's what we believe. We believe in the belonging for everybody. And that started from, we wanted to have belonging for refugee families. And then one day, a Somali mum walked through the door with an autistic child. And we thought, why stop at just being inclusive for refugees? So that's where our journey with disability started as well. And then inclusion. Inclusion is what we do. And that's where a critical element occurs. And what we're doing, and you heard Manos refer to it, we believe you fit the school to the child, not the child to the school. So our staff, our teachers, our critical people, the parents as well, are licensed to come up with plans that really adapt the whole setup for the child. So the child isn't being forced into very difficult, exclusive kind of situations that they just can't access. So really, I think in a nutshell, to be inclusive, you've got to want it.
Well, thank you. Mark, the GEM report stresses that teachers need support and training to teach in diverse classrooms. This was also one of the major findings of Education International's global survey, where teacher unions from around the globe identified that professional development and training for inclusive education was often of low quality or absent. With a student body made up of over 20 different ethnic and cultural groups, how do you prepare teachers at your school for the complexity of supporting diverse learners?
Thanks, Susan. That's a good question, actually. Because the state doesn't do a lot yet, and we are trying to pressure them to do a lot more initial teacher education, there are three things that we use as our ways of preparing our staff. As I said, we develop that mindset that everyone needs to have, but we use the 3 points of recruitment, training, and support. So you've got to recruit the right people. We look for people who have lived experience of diversity, people who've had sisters, brothers who may have had disabilities, who have lived in different parts of the world and just bring richer experiences to what they're doing. And we appoint a diverse group of people to be in the staff. So so often you go into some schools and the teaching staff and the support staff don't look anything like their community. So we make sure that we have diverse appointments with training. So universal design is often referred to. That's something that we really believe strongly in. And the universal design means that when you recognize a need, you have to come up with a design that will match what that child needs. And so often our biggest allies in that are the families, the parents, because they have PhDs in their children. They really do help. It's terrific. We bring in experts because the ministry doesn't always have those people, our education ministry, so we look for them ourselves. We develop understandings. For instance, we have a saying in our education outside the classroom, we all go or no one goes. So no child is left behind. I never walk in and find a child sitting in a classroom with a teaching assistant because they're too disabled to go anywhere. Every teacher puts their thought into how they're going to get that child to share and participate and achieve success. The support, the first thing is to let all our teachers know that we've got their back. So if they are going to go out on a limb, and our teachers do all the time, coming up with different ideas, different things to support a child, they need to know that they've got my support. And they've had to have my support at times against school inspectors and people like that. But when they know they're supported, they will go the extra mile. We need to give them time, because when you're dealing with complexity, it takes a lot to prepare a classroom. It takes a lot to support all those different needs. We have a lot of paraprofessionals, teaching assistants in our school, a lot more than most. And that's why we're able to make such a difference for children. It's quite critical to that. And the last thing I'd say is we provide the opportunity for them to work as teams to solve problems, because every child has their own problems.
Yeah, look, thank you, Mark. That's very, very interesting. And that model of recruitment, training and support seems like one which really works. And it's good to hear from you about that. Let's now hear from our second panelist, Sonia Alesso, who is General Secretary of the Confederation of Education Workers of the Republic of Argentina. Her union is at the forefront of defending education as a public good and promoting the right to education for all in Argentina and the international level, together with Education International. Sonia, one of the main findings from the report is that for all students to feel welcome at school, the teaching body should reflect the diversity in the classroom. In your opinion, what are some of the barriers that need to be overcome to increase diversity in the teaching workforce? And welcome, Sonia.
Bueno, lo primero es que haya leyes en cada uno de los países, como la Ley Nacional de Educación en la Argentina, la 26206, que garantiza la diversidad de los docentes en el trabajo y a su vez la formación. Desde la Internacional de la Educación a nivel mundial venimos promoviendo todo lo que tiene que ver con garantizar el trabajo decente y la inclusión de trabajadores y trabajadoras con discapacidad. Esto supone nuevamente no solo discutir programas educativos que incluyan las distintas diversidades que hay en el sistema educativo, sino también la inclusión de docentes, de personal de apoyo con discapacidad que puedan no solo tener una formación educativa de calidad, sino también incluirse en el marco del trabajo decente.
Thank you, Sonia. As your response highlights, we must ensure that teaching and learning environments are fully inclusive and guarantee teaching decent working conditions. Only then can we attract and retain talented and diverse teachers in the teaching profession, including teachers with disabilities. The GEM report measures progress towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4. As highlighted in the SDG Education 2030 Framework for Action, institutionalised social dialogue with teachers and their unions needs to be strengthened in order to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 4. EI believes that the recommendations of the GEM report could have given the importance of dialogue with teachers more attention, and we welcome that this webinar gives teachers and their representative organisations a voice in discussing inclusive education from a teacher's perspective. This need for dialogue with teachers is also echoed in the recent call for action on teachers, which was issued by the Teacher Task Force. Sonia, a second question for you. We would like you to share what role your education union plays in advocating for the right to decent work for workers with disabilities, and what governments should be doing to ensure that the teaching workforce represents diversity.
Lo primero es garantizar presupuestos educativos en todo el mundo que tengan que ver con garantizar, por un lado, la participación de docentes con distintas diversidades, diversidad de distinto tipo de culturas sociales, culturales, que tienen que ver también con otro tipo de capacidades diferentes, y también garantizar la inclusión de personas con discapacidad en cada uno de los niveles del sistema educativo. Para esto es necesario llevar adelante políticas públicas que garanticen la inclusión educativa. La Internacional de la Educación lo viene señalando en cada uno de sus documentos, lo ha planteado también en el último Congreso Mundial de la IE, garantizar la inclusión de las personas con discapacidad en todo el mundo. Esta ha sido una lucha histórica del magisterio en todo el mundo y de los sindicatos docentes, y por eso rescatar, por un lado, el trabajo de inclusión educativa que lleva adelante nuestra Internacional de la Educación a nivel mundial, y bregar para que los gobiernos incluyan esta problemática dentro de sus agendas para el debate pedagógico.
Thank you, Sonia. Even if a country's policies aren't inclusive, a teacher often has leeway to teach in an inclusive way. Similarly, a country might have inclusive policies, but resource constraints mean that the gap between policy and reality in some classrooms is large. This gap can become even wider in humanitarian crisis situations. Uganda hosts one of the biggest refugee populations on the planet. We'd now like to hear from Baguma Filbert Bates, General Secretary of the Uganda National Teachers Union, on what action is required to ensure equity and inclusion remain central to the education of refugees and host communities. Filbert is a former school leader and, as part of his work in the union, promotes the rights of refugee teachers and children, and is involved in projects on child labour and school-related gender-based violence. Filbert, Baguma, how is your organisation working with the Ugandan government and other actors to promote the rights of refugee teachers and children? And welcome to you.
Thank you, Susan. First of all, Uganda has the highest number of refugees, I think, around the globe. Over 1 million refugees. And out of these, 61% are children under the age of 18 years. Now, Uganda National Teachers Union, as an institution that voices the concerns of the teachers, bases on the legal framework in the country. First and foremost, refugees in Uganda have got asylum and access to the same rights as citizens of Uganda. And that is, to mention but a few, the right to education, the right to freedom of movement and freedom of expression. And therefore, for us as a union, we have basically emphasized lobbying and advocacy. This is done because when you go to the refugee camps, you will find, due to the influx of refugees, you find high teacher-pupil ratios, you find job insecurity, you find the remuneration which is very poor, then language barrier, and then certification of the teachers who come as refugees. And then the policy reforms to see whether the policies can accommodate the refugee teachers. And therefore, that's why we basically look at advocacy and lobbying. We have lobbied the Ministry of Education and Sports to have a concern on education in emergencies. And right now, as I talk, the Ministry of Education and Sports has come up with an education response plan for refugees and host communities in Uganda. We are working also with other organizations. We have the UN agencies, we have the civil society organizations. These work together to contribute in terms of finance, in terms of technical expertise, and practical input. And this has helped the country to manage the education in emergencies. However, there is always that aspect of underfunding. But ours is to advocate for these teachers so that they also have job security. At first, they would be employed and then dismissed as and when the employer deems it fit. Some would be dismissed by a mere SMS on a telephone. But we have changed the status quo by lobbying and advocating for their job security. And right now, as I talk, at least the situation has improved from how it used to be.
Thank you, Filbert. You mentioned, you've been talking about the core challenges facing teachers in camp settings, which often see higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. Unfortunately, school-related gender-based violence affects thousands of children, families, and communities across Uganda. So could you tell us how you are working to ensure teachers have the skills required to foster the socio-emotional development of students who have been traumatized by sexual and gender-based violence or by the experience of displacement?
Yeah, thank you very much. Aware that these refugees come when actually they are freeing from human rights violations, and most prominent is the sexual violence and torture. For us as Uganda National Teachers Union, we have been engaged in the fight against school-related gender-based violence. And this, we have tackled it through creation of change teams. the change teams are members of the teaching fraternity who come to champion the issues of gender-based violence within our communities and most especially within the schools. And then within the schools themselves, we have also formed the change teams, and we have peer-to-peer mobilization and sensitization. Then we also go an extra mile to sensitize and train the teachers, because quite often it is an assumption that teachers are actually ready with what they are supposed to do. But when you go into the deeper meaning, you will find that some of our teachers are also victims of school-related gender-based violence. And therefore, we also train them, empower them, so that they are able to help the girl child and the boy child, because the boy child has to get that emancipation so that they can stand with the girls. Otherwise, if we only train the girls, if we only train the female teachers, then their strategic partners will not take part and it may not yield results. We also go an extra mile of sensitizing the parents and other stakeholders. Every other opportunity we get, because we have realized that even parents at some time think that their children have grown up and they have a feeling that the teachers are doing the part to train the girls. And the teachers also think there are some aspects which are taught to the girls by their parents. At the end of the day, in between, you find the girls falling victims. So that's why we go an extra mile to train and sensitize the parents and other stakeholders so that it is a concerted effort to fight school-related gender-based violence. And we have gone ahead to integrate school-related gender-based violence within our union program, so that every program we are carrying out as an institution, as a union, we re-echo school-related gender-based violence, because it is affecting very many, including our teachers, and therefore there are so many issues. And when it comes to education in emergencies, it becomes worse, because there the situation, the living conditions are not conducive. And we have also realized during this COVID-19 crisis, there are so many girls who are getting pregnant. There are so many sexual violences, and therefore there is a lot to do, even getting out of this COVID. And we are even now in the process of making sure that we can make sensitization more and more through radios and televisions, so that we can save the girl child. We are talking about the girl child more than the boy child, because the girls are more vulnerable in our Ugandan context.
Yes, thank you, Filbert, particularly for sharing those very important examples of how your union supports teachers working in incredibly challenging circumstances. Friends, in earlier interventions, we have heard many contributions that ask for more and improved professional development and training. Let's now hear from Jobix Kulumba, Education Permanent Secretary of Zambia. As a former teacher and school leader, he has been opening schools and promoting inclusive education for children with disabilities, and now continues this important work in the Ministry of Education. As a government representative, what would you identify as the major obstacle for teacher training and development in your country, and what measures does your government undertake to ensure that training is available to all teachers and prepares them to meet the diverse needs of students. Thank you, Jovix, and welcome.
Here in Zambia, the obstacles that we face are many, but I'll be limited to a few of them. One of them is a limited number of teacher training colleges in Zambia, the colleges that are aimed at training special education teachers. We have the Zambia Institute of Special Education, which has been in existence since independence in 1964. It is an institution that caters for the teachers who train in special education to cover visual impairment, hearing impairment, learning disabilities, and many aspects. But the total number of colleges, I want to emphasize, is very inadequate. And because it is inadequate, you don't have a lot of teachers in this country who are trained in special education. Many of the schools in Zambia, we have 10,000 schools in Zambia, 10,000 schools in Zambia, and only a segment, a fraction of those schools offer special education. Reason is simple, because we do not have a lot of colleges that release a large number of teachers that can go to help the children in different schools in the country. However, we are not sitting idle as a government. So far, what we have done is that in the existing colleges of education, we have asked all the principals to include components of special education in each and every sector of the college. All the teachers that are being trained in all the colleges of education, whether private or public universities and private universities, we have asked them to include special education as a component within their training programs. In this way, we are very confident that after the teachers have graduated from these colleges, at least each and every teacher will have the knowledge or the basic skills on how to handle the children with diverse special needs. So far, that's what we are doing, and we are very confident that this process is going to work out well, because we are very sure that from all the colleges that we have, I want to repeat, all the colleges that we have, each and every teacher, after graduating, every teacher will have the basic skills and the knowledge on special education. In this way, we are moving towards making inclusive education a reality, because a teacher is a key component in ensuring that special education or inclusive education becomes a reality. Now, what about development of teachers? Yes, we have also a problem in the sense that we don't have enough in-service training institutions in the country where the already trained teachers can go and receive in-service training. So what have we done as government again? In all the 10 provinces of Zambia, we have now come up with what we are calling provincial teachers resource centers. These are the centers where all the teachers who have trained in special education go for in-service training so that they refresh their knowledge. They are in-service training colleges that help the teachers to get skills, get reoriented on the, in the aspect of special education.
Thank you, Jovix. You've picked up there on some of the clear issues that and recommendations that have arisen from the GEMS report in relation to the training of all teachers about inclusive education. The GEM report also found that during the COVID-19 crisis, about 40% of low and lower middle income countries have not supported learners at risk of exclusion, such as the poor, linguistic minorities, and learners with disabilities. As schools are reopening, It will therefore be essential to closely monitor and assess how the most marginalised can be supported in order to prevent school dropouts and further educational exclusion. We at Education International suggest implementing equity audits at school level that will monitor the effect of school closures on the most marginalised and draw attention to inequalities that would otherwise remain invisible. Could you tell us perhaps, as a government representative, what do you think can be done in terms of data collection to promote inclusive education for all? And what have been some of the major challenges and how have you addressed them?
Correct. What should be done at the moment is to, first of all, understand or collect the data on the number of teachers that we have in the country. We must understand the number of teachers who are trained in special education. How many do we have in the country in the first place? We should also collect the data on the total number of children who are disadvantaged. Children with
we appear to have lost Jobix just at the moment. So I think, are you trying to get him back? Can someone tell me? And no, so okay. So look, we'll continue, and hopefully we'll be able to get Jobix back for the next session. Now, colleagues, we're at the end of our panel discussion. And I'd like to thank all the speakers for their participation and their excellent contributions to the panel. What a wide range of examples that we've had. The discussion will shortly continue in a Q&A session, but let me first try and summarise some of the major takeaways from this event that can guide future discussions on how to support teachers and education support personnel in teaching in inclusive classrooms. We've heard from teachers, school leaders, teacher unions and government representatives and international organisations how important it is to make teaching an attractive profession. In order to promote inclusive education, it will be necessary to provide more and better professional development and training for teachers and education support personnel that enables them to cater for the needs of a diverse student body. Our school leader and a government representative have shared what measures can be taken to improve training for teachers. And we discussed the role of education unions and how they, as the collective voice of teachers, contribute to the development and implementation of inclusive policies. Here, social dialogue and continuous engagement between governments and education unions and their members are the key strategies to ensure the policies match the needs of teachers and students. I'd now like to open the Q&A session. We're excited because we can hear from all the webinar participants, and the questions are questions that have been asked from some of the people listening tonight or today. Stefania, as well as Sonia, won't be able to join us for the session, but we look forward to hearing from the other panelists, and we hope that we can get Jobix back again. So Manos, I'm going to go to you first. From Manisha in India, we have the question. I am very much interested in learning what major aspects of teacher education frameworks or policies should be focused upon for the new normal of education.
Normal is a sensitive word when it comes to inclusion. Of course, we have heard this discussion about what is going to happen with the return to school and the urge to build back better. But I think it's important to maybe just look more generally. The problems that we had are still with us now. And I think what the crisis showed and what maybe the crisis helped expose some teachers more than they had been before was the stark reality that some of their learners were facing at home, because they encounter their learners at school, which is a different environment. It's a different setup. You see the troubles and the difficulties with which some students come to the classroom, but you don't see the very stark interaction you have at home when, of course, the connection for those who had the chance to be connected to the internet is not working, when the parents whom you communicate, especially with the younger children, cannot really communicate because maybe they speak another language or they don't feel confident. There was a range of challenges that teachers suddenly realized that they had to play an even bigger role than usually. So that brings us back to what is really a good framework for inclusive education. The report is borrowing one that has been applied by the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, which we feel is very important because it focuses on 4 aspects: support all learners, and support all learners not only on the academic side, but also on the social and emotional, the practical side. That is key. It's about working with others. And I think I mentioned before about the challenge that even schools that try to be inclusive or integrated, at least, we see mainstream teachers not necessarily working with special teachers and learning from each other. So that's essential to be built in. And of course, with other education professionals, because there are all sorts of challenges, and I mentioned that before, about support personnel. The third is to value learner diversity. We did hear great examples of how it is about believing in it, but that needs to be ingrained in a teacher education program and throughout the education career of a professional, so that teachers respect diversity. And finally, the fourth dimension is to engage in professional development through primarily self-reflection, to be reflective of one's own practices and whether biases come into the situation and how a teacher can actually fight those, and to make sure that they continue to self-improve. If supported by government programs on pre and inner service education, that education of a teacher continues. You learn, and then it's important to check and test that knowledge through ongoing training to be better.
Thanks, Manos, and thanks, Manisha, for your question. And I'm now going to go to Filbert and ask you a question from Kate in France, Filbert. And Kate's question is, how can we engage teacher unions in these recommendations to carry them forward at the country level?
Thank you, Susan. First of all, as key stakeholders representing the constituency of teachers, we need not only to be consulted by governments, but we need to be engaged so that whatever affects the education system, we are part and parcel of finding solutions. There are a number of challenges, and the challenges affect both the teachers and the learners. The moment the teacher's well-being is not catered for, it directly translates into the suffering of the learner. It has a direct impact, which is negative. And therefore, as teacher unions, we need to lobby the relevant authorities, the relevant officers, to make sure that we occupy our space. We need to advocate for the well-being of the teachers, because once the teachers are motivated, once the teachers are supported, then obviously we shall have quality inclusive education. Whatever affects the teacher will directly or indirectly affect the learners. And in this case, the teacher unions must be more proactive, must be part and parcel of the systems, the education systems within our countries. And that's how we can solve this. And more so, we need to advocate for increased funding of the ministries of education, of ministries responsible for education in our countries, so that when funding is increased, then most of the challenges that affect the education in our countries will be addressed. Unions, teacher unions also need to take an extra mile, moving from the country to also engage the donors and the partners, because quite often, sometimes the ministries responsible for education have got their own priorities. And because they have their own priorities, the learners end up being the sufferers as consequences of actions taken. And therefore, we need to also lobby and advocate for this so that the donors and the partners are also on our side. And then we help the learner to achieve quality, inclusive education.
Okay, thank you very much, Filbert. I'm now going to go to Mark. Mark, you're doing very well there because it must be well after midnight in New Zealand at this stage, I would have thought. Mark, I've got two questions to ask you, both relating to the classroom. So I'll go to one and then the other. The first one is from Kim in Myanmar. And Kim asks, in your opinion, what types of interventions can support teachers already struggling with full workloads to integrate inclusion in the classroom?
That's a good question. It's one that we've had to look at quite strongly in our school because a teacher's workload is huge anyway. So you start adding in complexity to it. You've got to start making decisions about what you're not going to ask that teacher to do. If you, the answer to that is there's nothing you want to drop, then you're going to have to put more resource in there for them. And we've found that the other adults, professionals in there working with them makes a big difference. I had a fabulous teacher telling me about all the things she was doing to support the complexity in her classroom. But as she was telling me, she had tears running down her face. And I just thought, I'm killing this woman. So we actually employed another teacher to work part-time in her classroom to give her the space to do the planning and the work that she needed to do to support those children. Many countries right now are obsessed with high-stakes evaluation and assessment. Most of those don't actually work for the kinds of children that we're talking about that need inclusion. So again, I think school leaders have to think about what they are asking of their teachers to make those differences. Otherwise, you'll just drive a teacher through the ground. Access to people, good quality experts that can help them out as well. You can't train everyone in everything because there's so much diversity out there. So I think there's a lot of work needs to be done within schools to support teachers because they are professional people and they need access to fellow professionals to help them within their roles. And that not just the teachers, but the support staff, the paraprofessionals, the teaching assistants, they also need skills because they're doing a pretty complex job.
Own school in response to the COVID pandemic and how you can see the longer term effects on the most marginalised learners in your community?
Well, with the COVID, it was a big learning curve for everyone, wasn't it? One of the things that we could see quite clearly was our government and our Ministry of Education was really keen to do something to support people, but they're working at such a high level that they couldn't see the individual families, communities, whereas schools in their communities are quite connected. We knew who were not going to be able to access a lot of the things that people have been talking about today, the equity issues, the lack of internet, I think Stefania talked about. So what we did as a school was we talked about who are the families who are likely to miss out, who are the families that we know of that don't have connections, and we divided our staff up into different kinds of teams as to who was going to support who. So some of the staff went online and worked with the children who could do things online. Other staff put together packs, we call them hard packs of books, papers and so on, and then we delivered those around the community. We're lucky that teachers were declared essential workers in our country. One of the other things we found was that children with disabilities particularly, they rely on adult relationship connection. So what we did was with our support staff, we have a concept in New Zealand called a bubble, where you can actually, a family is a bubble, but you can extend it by one household. So what our support staff did was they included families in the bubble that they worked with that child, and so they carried on working with them during the lockdown. If that wasn't possible, we actually trained our support staff up on being able to work with Zoom and work with the teachers, with the child, with the parents during that time. What we're going to have to do is watch them. We're very lucky in New Zealand. We're already out of lockdown. We're in a quite good space, but we are going to have to watch the children who don't have the same access as their peers do to resources. Because, I mean, you can lock down, offer all sorts of ideas, but not every parent has access to art materials, to resources, to a table. These are things that we need to take into account in the future.
Yes, very much so, and I think that has been found in every country of the world impacted by the pandemic. The differences in what is actually available to students when they're actually home rather than in school. Filbert, can I go to you now for a question? What do you think are the main barriers for teachers in your country to create inclusive learning environments, and how can these be overcome?
Thank you very much, Susan. One, the major barriers to inclusive learning environments are inadequate infrastructure. In a sense that in some areas you will find the infrastructure is there, but does not cater for the physically challenged learners. And therefore, access to these schools will automatically eliminate some class of learners. Then we have overcrowded classrooms, where you find there are very many learners in one class. This obviously will not cater for all levels or all learners. The average and slow learners will not benefit. Possibly the quick learners are the only ones who will benefit, and thus this will impact a lot on them. And of course, teachers will find it difficult to give individual help, because if you have a class of 100 learners, it is just like a church. It does not help to bring every child on board. Then equipment, in terms of, let's say, the blind, where you don't find enough brailles, then it becomes a challenge. The physically challenged, where they don't have wheelchairs or crutches, you find some of them will have nowhere to access the education institutions. We have inadequate continuous professional development in terms of equipping teachers to get knowledge on how to help these learners. Of course, minus those who can easily be identified, there are those who have challenges, but you can only identify them if you are equipped with the knowledge to know that, yes, you might find a teacher is in class, and when making classroom arrangement, puts a child at the back because the child is slightly tall. But this child could be having challenges with sight. And at the end of the day, the child will not learn. So if teachers are not taken through these refresher courses, specifically targeting on inclusion, then it remains a challenge. Then we have high teacher-pupil ratio, in the sense that in Uganda, the current teacher-pupil ratio is 1:53, the national one. However, you will find in a class where you will find the average is around 1:120. Now, this also affects the inclusiveness, because the teachers do not have enough time. They cannot create any other time apart from the time that is allocated. And this sitting, it is one class per teacher. Now, the situation makes it difficult, because if it is one class per teacher, that is on assumption that female teachers do not go for maternity leave, and the Ugandan constitution gives them 60 working days. Meaning, if you are in a school and you have teachers and some female teachers qualify for maternity leave, which is not negotiable, then there will be a crisis within the teaching learning process. That is again on assumption that teachers do not fall sick. Because if you fall sick, you are again supposed to go for medication. And in the event that you go for medication, where the staff sitting is one teacher per class, then in your absence, there is nobody to attend to your class. And this becomes worse when we have children of different categories. Of course, there are those who need the presence of the teacher. And the moment the teacher is not there, then the situation becomes worse. Now, what needs to be done, one is to look at the issue of refresher courses, because however good the teacher may be, we are in a changing world. Innovations come, reforms come in, and even new situations come. And therefore, there should be continuous professional development in the areas that need to be addressed during the teaching learning process. The ratio of teacher-pupil ratio should be lowered so that a teacher has time to look at all categories of learners, the slow learners, the quick learners, the average learners, and those with special needs, so that you can ably tackle the teaching learning process. Then we talk of inclusive education, but I think there should be also need to increase on specialized schools, because there are those in nature of their abilities who may need to go to specialized schools. And therefore, these specialized schools should also be put in place and well equipped, because there are extremes where you may need to have a teacher taking care of about 5 learners. Now, in the event that you put them in the mainstream, it becomes practically impossible, because these learners will not cope up with the rest. And therefore, specialized schools should also be taken care of. The plans.
Thank you, Filbert.
The plans for
just
building.
To finish now, please. Just to conclude. Thanks.
Yes. Just one last one. The plans for constructing classrooms. In the government, they take care of it. But when they go to private owners of institutions, they don't take care of the learners with physically challenges. So it means they are not taking care of them, and yet it is one government under one ministry, and therefore this should be looked into so that we can have inclusion both in public and private. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm sorry to have to cut you off there, but we've just run out of time, which is a pity because there are a couple of really good questions coming up and I was very interested. I would have been very interested to hear your responses. But we are nearing the end of the time of the webinar. No country in the world's reached a completely inclusive education system, which is why the GEM report has launched a poll for people to participate in no matter where they live. The link has just gone up on the chat and it asks you to say which of the GEM report recommendations should be prioritised first in your country and to send the poll results to your education minister. So have your say now and get your colleagues to have their say as well. Well, we've just examined the central role of teachers for inclusion. There is no one answer to the question in the poll because inclusive education is not an end goal, but a process. And plenty of countries have made extremely positive moves in the right direction. We must learn from the experience of others, share knowledge and resources, and support one another on this journey. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers who we have heard from over the past 90 minutes, because you are all true champions of inclusion, working to change mindsets at the school, community, and national level. Today's discussion is just the beginning of a movement that needs to be taken forward by all of us watching today. We each have a role to play ensuring that no child is left behind. And we're going to leave you with a final call to action from the GEM report, one that underlines that each of us has a role to play in ensuring inclusion and education. Thanks again to you all and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you.
We live in a world where no two people are the same. Each of us with our own unique abilities and challenges, preferences and dreams. A diversity that should be reflected across our school systems. But for many, it is not.
मी विचार केला की जर मोठ्या घरचे लोक शिकू शकतात तर आपण का नाही शिकू शकत. माझी तर इच्छा होती. त्याच्यानंतर हा पण विचार आला की माझ्या आई-वडिलांनी वर्षानुवर्ष रस्त्यावरती राहून काढले. मग त्यांना पण माझी इच्छा होती की त्यांना पण असं म्हणजे सगळे घरामध्ये राहतात. मला पण इच्छा आहे की मी पण एक स्वतःचा रूम घेईल शिकून मोठी झाल्यावरती.
By 2030, we aim to achieve inclusive education for all, no matter the region, income, or challenge ahead. This is the decade of action, and together we must ensure that all really does mean all in every classroom. To achieve true inclusion, we will need to place students' differences at the core of our education systems, understanding them as strengths to be celebrated, not as problems to be solved. From children to policymakers, parents to principals, everyone will need to get involved. Countries will need to understand the challenges and underlying disadvantages facing their students and directly address each individual's multi-layered needs. Inclusion cannot be achieved one group at a time. It requires more and better data on those being excluded from education to make the invisible visible again.
Accurate data is important for everything as a great starting point.
To make data come alive for action, you need these very lively and sustained partnerships.
But simply moving students from special schools into mainstream schools that lack the appropriate resources will not work. It requires a complete shift in systems and teachers that are well trained with the right learning materials and assessments to meet the needs of their students.
Guter Unterricht ist für uns kooperativer Unterricht, in dem Schüler auch gemeinsam Probleme lösen, nicht immer nur der Lehrer gefragt ist. Das heißt, ich verlasse meinen Status der allwissenden Lehrperson.
We need to break down preconceptions about particular groups to ensure that all children feel welcome in school and have the chance to thrive.
We believe that everybody at the lab is an agent of transformation. Some of them report that the lab gave them a voice. We help them in this way as to become protagonists, to awaken their potential.
Across the world, governments and policymakers will need to ensure equitable financing. Allocating these resources to children that are the furthest behind will need to be planned jointly.
Partnership cannot be overemphasized. So you may not be a health person, but you may be an administrator, you may be an innovator. We can put all of these to the table and then make it work.
The path ahead will have its challenges, but working together, learning from our peers, we can ensure that all means all, and every child has the chance to reach their full potential.